I'm Dr. Colin King. I'm the Director of Postgraduate Research Studies at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, and I'll be chairing the session today. Before I start and say a bit more about the webinar and our speakers, as with all Zoom events, I need to set out some practical matters at the outset. First of all, this event is being recorded and participants cannot unmute themselves or turn on their video. Chat is only visible to the chair and not all participants. So our speakers will be able to see the chat, but everyone else will not be able to see it. Okay, so first of all, to say thanks a lot to Dali Sarkos, our events manager at IALS, for setting up this Zoom webinar. Doing a PhD then. Doing a PhD can be a minefield, and this webinar is aimed at answering any questions that you might have, whether about the application process, about doing a PhD, or what next post-PhD. And looking at the list of participants, we do have a wide variety of people online today. I know some people are thinking of doing a PhD, others are well underway with your research, and some of you have recently finished. We have 4 speakers who will each briefly give a short talk, approximately 5 minutes each, and then we will open it up for questions. Please put your questions in the chat box, and we will try to get through as many as we can in the time afterwards. So our speakers then, first of all, we have Dr. John Child from University of Birmingham. Then we have Dr. Avena Usaba from LSE, followed by Dr. Lucy Welch from University of Sussex, and then finally myself. So I now pass over to John to get us started.
Okay, hello everybody. So as said, I'm John Child. I'm a reader in criminal law at the University of Birmingham. In fact, all of us, I think, are pretty crimey in our outlooks, but hopefully the advice we give you will be generalizable beyond that. I did my PhD actually at Birmingham as well in 2007 to 2010. After that, I went to Oxford Brookes University and University of Sussex before eventually, quite recently, finding my way back to Birmingham. So I'm going to talk to you about, briefly, in terms of my sort of route into academia, a few warnings and hopefully a couple of tips that might be useful as well along the way. My route, where I began, I come from a sort of small village in Norfolk, very much kind of rural background, state school and all the rest, no lawyers in the family or anything quite so dramatic. And law for me, I think like a number of people who end up with a law degree, was a bit of a lucky dip where I definitely wanted to go to university, but I had no idea what I wanted to do at university. And law seemed like a good solid option for those who kind of want to do something with themselves. So I went that way and I very much won the lucky dip. I fell in love with the subject very early on, enjoyed it very much. But I didn't love all of it. And I found that the bits of the law that I really enjoyed was thinking about what the law is doing wrong and how it can be made better, as opposed to necessarily the detail of every item that the court was saying. And I think in that sense, why that was important is I decided that I was much more interested in the debating of the law than I was the mooting of the law. And that lends itself very much more towards a kind of an academic outlook. And I realized actually in the first year of my undergrad that that's what I wanted to do. I was also lucky around that time I was doing my undergrad, there'd been various kind of industrial actions at universities, which is not ideal when you're a student, but it had made the job in academia actually one that was worthwhile. So it was also important to me, particularly from my background, that I actually got a job that paid me something. And academia was becoming a vocation that would pay properly as well. So I went for that. And in terms of my first beware, I think you always have to be a little bit beware when you're doing your undergraduate and you're thinking about an academic future. Beware of kind of wildcard advice or someone who might put you off the idea. Now, for me, that was actually a personal tutor in, I think, my second year, who looked at my file when I came in for a meeting and sort of very studiously looked over the top of it and reminded me that being an academic would involve quite a lot of reading and writing. And it was very clear that she had noticed on my file, it said I was dyslexic, which was very nice. And she was gently trying to put me off the idea that to be an academic as a dyslexic student would be highly unusual. Fortunately, I was not put off that. And And I know a number of dyslexic academics who were not put off in that way. And so again, it's about encouraging you, whatever your background, whatever your interest, as long as you're interested in the subject in the right way, as long as you go about your research in the right way, then this is very much a career that you should think about and be interested in. The biggest problem for me after the undergraduate was I didn't have the faintest clue, though, actually what I wanted to do my PhD on. I made a snap decision because I knew I wanted to go straight into the PhD, that I decided I was going to go for EU social policy because I thought as an EU lawyer I would always have a job, which shows why that's not necessarily the best reason to choose your PhD topic. But luckily, I had another bit of a win where I managed to get a job at the Law Commission, where I was for a year as a research assistant. And that was absolutely a wonderful place to go for lots of reasons, but not least for the training it gives you. The Law Commission, the whole basis of the Law Commission is to think about what's wrong with the law, problems with the law, reforming of the law, and so on. And it was a very good headspace for me in terms of thinking about that transition from an undergraduate where you're learning the law through to a PhD, where it's very much about critique and thinking about how the law can be made better or understanding the law on a different level. And that for me was a real eye-opener, and it was from that I found my topic within the criminal law, and I switched to doing a PhD in criminal law. So I guess just to finish there, my sort of top tip takeaway, I guess, and now as my role is admissions for PhDs in the Birmingham Law School, I see this a lot, is beware of starting a PhD just because you want a PhD. It's absolutely pivotal that you have a topic that you are passionate about when you go into your PhD. If I had done a PhD in social policy just because I needed something, it would have been a disaster. And I know I'd have spent at least my first year going back and forth on a topic that I was never passionate about and that I never really came to terms with as a decent topic. Now I know it's normal that people, much more expected that people do masters before they go on to a PhD anyway. So of course that kind of forces you to broaden your horizons a bit. And I guess that's the very much one of the positives about that. But I would say, if you don't know your topic yet, don't start your PhD yet. Take the time, have a think about it, it doesn't mean you have to know the answer to all the questions, but you have to have questions which excite you, and you have to have questions which you know and you've discussed and you've thought about and you realize them as being viable for a PhD project. And if in doubt, delay and wait till you're at the stage where you really are passionate about it. When I get proposals now from people that say, I'd like to do a PhD in law, maybe some crime, but I'm not quite sure, I tell people to go away and think again. You need to come with a topic and everything else will go smoothly from there. Okay, we can pick up anything else in questions. Thanks.
Cheers, John. Over to Avena next.
Thank you. So like John, I'm going to talk about my path into doing a PhD and also my path from PhD into academia. So I completed my PhD back in 2012. I started my undergraduate degree many years before that. I don't want to age myself too much by giving the date. At the time of starting my undergraduate degree in law and LLB, I had no intention of going on to do a PhD or going into academia. My plan was to become a criminal barrister. So I was fortunate in as much as I knew what I wanted to do. I knew which area of law interested me, and that didn't change. It's always been criminal law and criminal justice related issues. Once I finished my undergraduate degree, I decided to go on and do a master's. And I went from Bristol, where I did my undergrad degree, to UCL in London to do a master's specializing in criminology and criminal justice. And the thinking there was that it would give me an opportunity to study criminal justice related issues in much more depth than you can at undergraduate level, but also that it might help me to get jobs and secure pupillage once I'd done the bar course. The problem was that I then couldn't afford to do the bar course after finishing the master's, because I took out a huge loan to do the master's and I couldn't really afford to take out another huge loan. So I ended up working, doing temping jobs, admin, making about minimum wage. It was awful. It was the pay was awful, but it was also just mind-numbingly boring. So I started applying for jobs which I thought would be of more interest to me. And these were namely research jobs, researching criminal justice related issues with think tanks, government bodies, charities, and so on. I didn't have any luck with that. It seemed that they wanted people with more experience, and a lot of them wanted people who had a PhD. And I also found at this time that I missed studying. And this was surprising because there are lots of times undergrad and master's level where the thought of ever having to write another essay was extremely triggering. So 6 months after finishing my master's, I was surprised to miss engaging with academic work, reading literature, coming up with ideas, doing research, writing. So I decided to pursue a PhD, thinking this would give me the qualification that I need to do the kind of jobs that I will enjoy in the long term. And in the meantime, I'll be doing something that I enjoy. So I put together a research proposal, and I knew, unlike John, I knew exactly what I was interested in and what I wanted to do. I really enjoyed studying evidence at both undergrad and master's level. So I put together a research proposal looking at requirements that are placed on defendants to participate in criminal proceedings, things that had come up when I've been studying the right to silence on previous courses, and thinking about what this means for the nature of our criminal justice system. So I sent my proposal, I applied to various universities, mostly in London because I wanted to stay in London. My preference was to go back to UCL where I did my master's and to be supervised by the person who taught me at master's level. So again, I think I was quite fortunate insofar as I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my PhD. I knew exactly where I wanted to do it, and I knew exactly who I wanted to supervise it. And thankfully, I was accepted onto the program at UCL, and I had the supervisor that I wanted. So at the time of starting this PhD, I was driven to do it because I missed studying and engaging in that way, but also because I thought it was going to get me a good research job. I had no intention of becoming an academic when I started the PhD. It was only once I started that I was getting more insight. And I got more insight partly because my dad was actually an academic. So I am a second generation academic. He became an academic much later in life, and I didn't grow up with him, and he was in a different field in a different university and so on and so forth. So it didn't become relevant or valuable to me until I was going down that path. And then having him was invaluable, especially having a Black person who's been through, and I mean been through the system. So all of my questions and concerns and queries that I was too embarrassed to take to supervisors or anyone else, I could take to him. He did for me what a very sort of invested mentor could do. And that's something that I would advise, that if you are pursuing or starting a PhD, is to seek out a mentor, and that may or may not be your primary supervisors. But my biggest insights into academia came from working alongside doing my PhD, and I worked part-time for an academic, for a professor in a different university in a different field, doing admin and some research work. And that was interesting because, it was necessary for me to work to cover living costs, but it was also in some ways a nice respite from the PhD because it can be very intense, very isolating and very intense. So it sort of got me out of my own head. It did, though, sometimes feel like I was working full-time and studying part-time, which wasn't great. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend working alongside doing a PhD unless necessary. But I was fortunate with this job that it gave me real insight, not just into the research and teaching components of being an academic, but just the way that universities work and university politics and so on. So it wasn't really until towards the end of my third year of my PhD maybe that I decided I wanted to pursue a career in academia. The main draw was the research aspect of it, and that unlike the kind of jobs that I've been seeking previously, as an academic, I set my own research agenda. So I have autonomy within limits, but I have autonomy over what I research and what I focus on, and I have the opportunities to engage with government, with charities, with NGOs, and so on. So once I'd also done a little bit of teaching and realized that I kind of liked that too, it made sense to pursue academia as a career path. And then again, I think a lot of my career path has come down to good fortune. I was lucky that it didn't take me too long to secure my first lectureship. A year after completing my PhD, I started my first lectureship at Sussex, and then moved to City a couple of years later, and now to my current post at the LSE. And again, happy to pick up on any of that in the Q&A.
Thanks, Avena. Over to Lucy now.
Okay, thanks. And thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. So I had a bit of a different route into academia. I'm the newbie here among the four of us. That's not to say, however, that I kind of only recently did all of my studies. So I did my undergrad at a teaching intensive university way back in the early 2000s. I chose to do a BA, so I did law with human resource management because I'd had no prior contact with any aspect of the law. Like John, none of my family had been lawyers. I was kind of the first generation in that sense. But my dad, like Avena, was also in his final career move in academia. So I went in thinking that I was probably going to be a practitioner, and completed my undergrad. I had human resource management as a backup in case I didn't like the law, but I did like the law, and like everyone else, I fell in love with it very quickly, and I fell in love with criminal law straight away. So I finished my degree and had decided, yeah, I'm going to be a practitioner. I want to be in criminal law. And so I decided I wanted to be a solicitor. I went and did my legal practice course at BPP. I did that part-time, and I worked as a paralegal while I was doing my legal practice course. I then took a fairly standard route at that time. I got a training contract at the same firm, and I actually stayed working at that firm for about 12 years in total. I've been in practice about 4 years when I thought I wanted to perhaps do something a little bit different. So I went and did an LLM, and I did that part-time at Kent. Just because, to be frank about it, Kent was the institution nearest where I was practicing. But it turned out obviously to be a great move. I had a great supervisor for my LLM dissertation, and he suggested that I might want to consider doing a PhD. And I took a year break between my LLM and my PhD to decide, actually, is this for me? Do I want to go down or continue down the practitioner career route, or do I want to shift slightly, or quite a lot, I guess? Ultimately, I obviously decided that I felt I could make more of a difference in academia, and I'll explain what I mean in a little bit more detail. Essentially, there was obviously things that I saw in practice happening. There were changes to policies and procedures that I was really uncomfortable with, and I thought one way perhaps of trying to remedy some of these things, and this is quite an idealistic view I accept, was to perhaps go and research them and engage in these debates at a different level. So that's what I decided I was going to do. I did, however, continue to practice during my PhD studies. So I spent 1 day a week still with my same firm throughout my PhD process, and I do actually still retain a consultancy role with them. So I do the odd bit of trial advocacy and things still. I still hold a practicing certificate. I guess I would say that the key differences between practice and academia are the writing style is a big practical thing. So as a practitioner, you write so differently compared to academia. In practice, you're used to being kind of very short, sharp, this is the answer and that's it. Academia, there's much more nuance to the debates that happen. And I did spend the first 2 years of my PhD being told every single time you write like a lawyer. Obviously that changes, and actually you can use both kind of skill sets then to your advantage. The other big thing I think that is different is that the payoffs in academia are less immediate than the ones in practice. So in practice, you go, you do your case, you get the result, and you move on. Research evolves much more slowly, and it's a much more kind of constant process. However, I do think that the payoffs when they come from academia are bigger and they are more nourishing. You do feel that you're in a position there to make potentially a difference at a bigger level. So that would be kind of my key issue that I wanted to raise.
Cheers, thanks Lucy, and I'll just round this off before we open up for Q&A. Similar to John, I was the first person in my family to go to university. I done my PhD at the University of Limerick in Ireland. I was born in Limerick, I grew up in Limerick, I done my degree in Limerick. I took a short break, and after that short break I returned to Limerick to do my PhD. I deliberately stayed in UL, the University of Limerick, to work with my supervisor, Dermot Welch. During my degree, I never envisaged academia as a career route. I anticipated, just like Lucy mentioned there and Avena, that I would complete my degree, that I would sit the Law Society entrance exams in Ireland before eventually going on to qualify as a solicitor. Again, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in criminal law as well. But during the final year of my degree, I attended a postgraduate options session in Limerick, and that made me think that postgraduate study might be an option for myself. After my PhD, I moved to the UK. I initially had a 3-year contract in Leeds. At the end of that, I was lucky, and a lot of my career has come down to luck in so many ways. I was lucky to be offered a permanent position in Manchester. After a few years in Manchester, I was offered a senior lectureship in Sussex, and that's where we all met, in Sussex. And after 5 years in Sussex, I'm now based in London. What I want to talk about just for the next minute or so is the application process, because I know some of you on the webinar today are contemplating doing a PhD and are currently going through the application process. And after that, then we will open up for Q&A. Just using my own example, my own institution as an example of how the PhD process operates. When an application is received, it's first reviewed by the applications team, who check that the entire application is complete, that all supporting documentation has been supplied. If it's incomplete, it will be sent back. It won't come to academics for further review. After that, the complete application will be reviewed by the Director of Postgraduate Research. So in IALS, that's myself. I might ask other people to also review the application if it's beyond my expertise. We might then look to, if it's deemed to be of a high standard, we would then look at who could potentially supervise this PhD. What I would emphasize to everyone here is the importance of your research proposal. Every application must include a research proposal. There will be different rules in different institutions, so do check out what those different rules are. But the proposal is essentially to demonstrate both the quality and the potential of your project. So do make sure it is as good as it can be. Please make sure there are no grammar or spelling mistakes before you submit it. It should look professional. Clearly set out your research questions or your hypothesis. This might be a concise statement of the problem or the topic of your research, because many proposals that we receive, and I know all 4 of us have this experience, many proposals are too broad or too vague. So it is important to reflect on your research question or your hypothesis to ensure your project is clearly focused. You might also include a draft outline of the structure, and of course we do expect this might change during the course of your PhD. You won't be held completely to your proposal as you go through your PhD. It will evolve, and that is recognized by everyone as well. It is useful to ask yourself some questions when you are preparing your proposal. What will my project do? So what? Who cares? Why is this important? Get that message across in your proposal. If you are planning on doing empirical research, say a bit more about that. Who will you interview? How many interviews do you plan to do? How will you get access to these people? So you do need to demonstrate the feasibility of your research. And the research should be achievable within, on average, 3 to 4 years full-time or 6 to 8 years part-time. So do think about that time frame. And again, just be aware that there are that it is natural for ideas to evolve and change over the course of your thesis. So these are just some general words of advice to keep in mind as you prepare your proposal and your application. Again, we can pick up on these in Q&A afterwards as well. So again, speaking of Q&A, we'll move on to that now. And if anyone does have any questions, please do put them in the chat box and we will pick up on them there. First question that we have prepared in advance is, how did you decide your topic? So now, Avena, you've mentioned already that. So if I move on to John for this, how did you decide your topic, John?
So like I say, mine was originally EU social policy, which was horrible, but that was just because I found a book in the library about it, and I thought that would be kind of nice to re-envisage. But my proper proposal came along because when I was working at the Law Commission, I was working on the reports that were, or the consultations at that time, on attempts and conspiracy. And I remember it was kind of interesting where we were working on those reports and they were using a particular mechanism for understanding crimes, which is element analysis, talking about acts, circumstances and results of crimes. And I found it curious because in these meetings at the Law Commission, they were saying, well, we rejected this mechanism in the 80s because we said it didn't work, but now we're going to use it because we think it's useful. But there was no engagement with why, what had changed. And the Law Commission, quite rightly, their view was, well, we don't go into the kind of legal theory stuff. We have to stay quite practical. And so I liked the Law Commission's project, but I was bothered by this mechanism. So yeah, so my PhD became this could be kind of cool, like that I could do that work. So I decided that my project was going to be, all right, if this mechanism is necessary for the law, how can it work? And that took me in all kinds of different directions. Importantly, like I sort of said before, it was a question I was really interested in, but I think equally importantly, it was a question I didn't know the answer to. And I think those are often the ones that make the most interesting PhDs, where it's a voyage of discovery. It's not just here's a load of stuff I'm going to summarize. It's actually something that you can kind of investigate and play around with.
Cheers, John. Avena, can I come to you next? Because you mentioned during your talk there about the supervisor and the institution. So how important was the supervisor or the institution when choosing where to apply for your PhD?
I mean, for me, it was very straightforward because the supervisor I wanted was at the institution that I wanted to be at. And it was partly the familiarity of it because I'd done my master's. I know this person, they've taught me. Then it also was great that happens to be one of the best law schools and one of the top people in the field. So it all came together very nicely. I think it is important to scope out a supervisor who has the required expertise for your topic and will be able to support you and your topic. And that's maybe depending on what it is that you're doing the PhD for and what you want to do with it, but it's probably more important than trying to get into the top elite institution to do a PhD, is having people within that institution who are passionate about the same topic that you're passionate about and can support and nurture you. And I remember my supervisor saying at I think it was my supervisor at the beginning of the PhD that they start as the expert and by the end of this, I will be the expert teaching them. So it has to be that kind of relationship, I think.
I was very similar in that I went to Limerick for my PhD because of the supervision there. I deliberately wanted to work with a particular person, and it does make a big difference. And I was very lucky with my supervisor. I did feel very supported, and I think that is key when you are doing a PhD, having a supportive supervisor. Can I pick up on another point there, actually, because I mentioned when I spoke that I done my degree in Limerick after growing up in Limerick, and I then done my PhD in Limerick. So my education was entirely at the University of Limerick. Do you have any advice on this, whether you might move elsewhere or whether it's better to move elsewhere or to stay? Avena again.
Again, I think it probably depends on what you want to do. I think that variety is a good thing, being able to, because different institutions work in different ways, and there will be different focuses and research environments in different institutions. So especially if you want to get into academia, experiencing how things operate in different institutions will be incredibly valuable. At the same time, in terms of going into a PhD and knowing who your supervisor is and having that relationship sort of with them already and knowing that this is someone who will be able to supervise your work and you'll get on with, is less risky. And in terms of, looking for a supervisor in general, it would be advisable to sort of scope people out, maybe approach people to have a conversation with them before committing to that person being your supervisor.
Great, thanks. Question for Lucy. I see we have some questions coming in there, which is a quick question for Lucy before we move over to the chat. Teaching during the PhD. Did you teach during your PhD?
I did. So I was lucky enough to get some funding to do my PhD, and one of the conditions was that I did 4 hours a week of teaching at the institution, obviously. So I taught 4 hours a week. I mentioned that I stayed in practice. That was 1 day a week. The key things about teaching, I guess, is that it's important and increasingly important to teach actually during your PhD if you want to go into academia. Institutions do like to see that you've got some teaching experience, but I would limit the amount of teaching. Your priority really should be your research at that point. So we used to get repeat teaching, and we used to, I taught the same seminar basically for the whole period that I was doing the same seminars, I should say, for the whole period that I was doing my PhD.
And that's a general piece of advice that I think anyone can take, even post-PhD as well. If you have the chance for repeat seminars rather than learning a new module from year to year, it makes a big difference to allow you to get on top of your research. Lucy, how did you find time to do all of this practice, teaching, and your research?
Well, I took about 4 years basically to finish my PhD, and yeah, it was intensive for a good few years there, but definitely worth it at the end, and that's what everybody who I know says. It's intensive, but when you get there, it's definitely worth it.
Great, thanks, Lucy. So, John, we come over to you next. So we have a question in the chat here. So, in your opinion, should a person give a preference to a topic with funding at a lower ranked university, or picking your own topic at a higher ranked university but without funding?
So I think the answer to this will obviously depend on individuals to a large extent. But it is a useful reminder, I think, that there's a whole load of factors that go into targeting and where you go. So I think, as Avena said, and for me, probably the leading one is who's going to supervise you. So it's less about the institution. There's always big benefits for certain institutions over others, but having that researcher who's a specialist in your field can be really, really useful in terms of that mentoring. Some of it's about a comfort factor as well, depending on sort of what you need, where you feel that you will be able to work. So actually, it turns out that most of us pretty much stayed at the same institution to do our PhD. Now, it's funny because we would generally advise, as we probably have already, people to go out, variety, spice of life and all the rest. But actually, sometimes you recognize that when you're in that position, when you're going to take on a PhD and you've just been at a certain place for a while, life can take over in all kinds of ways, and you end up sort of wanting that comfort of where you are in order to kind of hit the ground running. In terms of the specifics of this question, there's not that much, although it's an increasing area, to have these specialized PhDs. It's obviously very common in sciences and outside of the law to have topic-based PhDs where you employ people onto your project as an academic member of staff, and that hence coming with the funding. It's much more common that for a PhD you'll choose your own topic. But to the extent that they do exist, I think they can be very, very valuable. Obviously, guaranteed funding is a massive thing. Certainly for me, the list of institutions I was interested in was only about funding. That had to be topped because it was the only way of making a PhD viable for me. Different people will be in different situations on that. So that's obviously something to keep in the mix. In terms of high-ranked, low-ranked university, less fussed about that personally. I think possibly one of there are some benefits obviously with the high-ranked universities in terms of the research environment. There's also an advantage if they have a larger, more specialized staffing base, that if for whatever reason your supervisor chooses to go somewhere else, 3 years is a long time, that there may be other people who are more naturally backups who can step into your supervision.
So I think we have lost John there for a second. We'll give it. He's back. John, we
Oh,
dropped
hello.
you there for a second.
Yeah, I think I'm now frozen in my own picture. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes, we can hear you
There
perfectly.
you are, wonderful. I was only saying gold, of course. Yeah, it's just to say that obviously a variety of factors and consider and weigh them up, right? It's also the fact that at this point in your life doing a PhD, you're a full grown up and life often takes over, and it's amazing how often you find yourself staying in that place afterwards. So pick an area of the world that you wouldn't mind being for a little while is also in there as well.
Cheers, John, and thanks to Nishant for that question. We have another question from Sarah. How do you find a mentor who could help or guide you? So besides your supervisor. So Avena, if we come to you on that one.
Sure. I mean, I think there's not one way to find a mentor. And my personal experience was that, I had my dad there for support, and I was also lucky that I had a good relationship with my supervisors. And then my sort of career mentor ended up being my external examiner of my PhD, who kind of took a liking to my work and was a very nice person and remains a very good friend. So yeah, finding people within your specific interest and field, and that could be rather than waiting until your external examiner comes along and takes you under their wing, at conferences and events. So there's excellent opportunities to network, and just you kind of have to put yourself out there a little bit. If there's someone that you meet and they work in a similar field to you, and say, hey, I really like your work, and have a conversation. I've had PhD students just come and knock on my office door in my department and say, hi, can I just say hello? And then they come in and we chat. And so putting yourself out there and approaching academics who you think this person could be a good person to talk to, and the mentor relationship will or will not happen. You can't force it with any individual. But academics generally, we're not scary, we are approachable, and we want to help and support PhD students and help people get into academia.
Yeah, I think that's very important there, that last point about don't be put off at approaching people. People are approachable. People are generally friendly for the most part. So just talk to people. Another option there that I was lucky with when I was doing my PhD was to have people who were a couple of years into the PhD. So when I was in first year, someone who was in third year, for example, and I could always turn to that person for advice generally about the PhD program or about doing different things, and I thought that was invaluable. Can I pick up on this point that was mentioned there by Avena as well about being at conferences? So Lucy, if I can come to you on this, how important is it to attend or to present at conferences during your PhD? Because I know you were very heavily involved in the SLSA.
Well, yeah, so I'm definitely an SLSA person in that. So SLSA, Socio-Legal Studies Association, is the conference that I pretty much go to every year. Now, it so happened that my primary supervisor was chair of the SLSA while I was doing my PhD. So she really encouraged me to go to conferences, and it's definitely something that I would encourage PhD students to do. But that doesn't mean that you have to kind of lean in straight away and be going and presenting straight away. So most academic conferences will run a PGR version immediately preceding their annual conference. The first year of my PhD, I just went to the PGR conference, and you start to get to know people, and I met people there that I'm still in touch with now. The second year, you kind of go along to the main one, and then I think I started presenting. Third year, I presented some of my research. So I did empirical work during my PhD, so I was able to go and present some of my data. But I'd been to a couple of conferences before that. I got to know some people before that, and I felt more comfortable. And I think when you go and see other people presenting, obviously you start to think, oh, actually I can get a feel for this, I'll be able to handle it. So I would encourage attending the PGR first, just attending, finding your feet, but towards the end of your PhD, you should sort of present at least once or twice, I would say.
And certainly engaging with other PhD students while you're doing your PhD, meeting them at conferences is very important. I remember my first conference, I had a very similar experience as you, Lucy, there. And even just for having someone to talk to at the conference, because a conference can be a lonely experience when you don't know anyone, and there are over 1,000 people at this particular conference, whether it's the SLSA or the British Society of Criminology conference, whatever it might be. Even just to have someone to talk to during the coffee breaks makes a big difference. John, can I ask you a question, because I'm conscious of the time, and I know that during the last half hour or so, your child arrived home. So can I just ask you a general question about managing research, managing your current job, especially with the pandemic, working at home and also having a child at home?
Yeah, of course. So he's, apologies if you hear any shouting from the other room, but his mother's looking after him at the moment. So yeah, it's obviously a juggle, and that's actually, it's a worthwhile thing to mention as well during a PhD. It's a time in life where things can change pretty dramatically on that side as well. So actually, I went pretty straight through mine, but for example, my wife had our child when during her PhD, so she ended up deferring during her final year for a period of maternity leave, and then having the wonderful little bit of write-up to do as she finally got back to work afterwards, which was a bit traumatic. But I think it is worth remembering that sort of life juggling happens, and I think with all of us, when we're supervising PhD students, we see this all the time. People get married, people get divorced, people have babies, people do all kinds of things, and it's that time in your life where you have to juggle lots of different things. At the moment, I guess one of the nice advantages of academia, at least outside of teaching terms, is it's pretty flexible. So whereas my wife has to work core hours, and so she gets the office during those times, in the morning early and in the evening late, that's my time to shine, where I can come in and sort of essentially be a bit more flexible with my own timetable. So there's lots of academics juggling all kinds of different things, be it kind of practitioners alongside, be it families, etc., etc., etc. It's a job that is not always flexible. You have to be there for certain things, particularly around teaching timetables, but the flexibility it has is really valuable. And certainly it's one where when we choose to do a certain project, we can really launch into it. And during other times, we can have sort of self-imposed downtimes as well, which are equally important.
Cheers, John. We've a very important question, I think, from Eliana about publishing. So how early on should we start trying to publish, whether essays or blogs? Should we start at undergrad level or master's, or only when on the PhD? And what are some key factors that we need to showcase on the application to show that we have academic potential? So if we take those as two separate questions, first of all, publishing, and when should you start publishing? And then the separate question about showcasing academic potential. So Avena, if we come to you first about starting to publish, what advice might you give?
Sure. So I don't think that publishing is necessary in order to get onto a PhD program. There's no expectation that anyone has published, be it in academic journals or blog posts or wherever, in order to get to that stage of studying. Publishing becomes more necessary for the academic job market. If you want to get an academic position, if you want to be a lecturer, you will, assuming that research is a part of your job and it's not a teaching only contract, usually it will have a research component, there will be an expectation that you publish. And in order to be able to show your potential to publish and to develop a body of internationally recognized excellent work, whatever else it needs to be for the ref, the best way to show that is to have publications, which those are where you're applying for jobs, they can look at those publications. So, I mean, I published my first article in, I think, the final year of my PhD. And I think since 2012, publications have probably become even more important than they were 8 years ago. But I think once you're sort of maybe like halfway through the PhD, if it's a full time into the second, third year of the PhD, that's when you think about publishing. You don't want to rush it. The publication process is long. and it is quite intense, and it can take, I've written articles that have taken more than a year to complete and get published. So it is a good idea to be thinking about it once you're settled into the PhD and you've found your groove in your writing style and so on. But it's also something that doesn't necessarily need to be rushed. And then I think it would be ideal, if you're looking to go into the academic job market, that there are 1 or 2 publications by the end of the PhD. And with a lot of jobs, I'd also emphasize that it's quality over quantity of publications. So having a couple of really good quality publications rather than 10 very short off the cuff blog posts or whatever makes a big difference.
So I was similar in that regard, Avena. I published towards the end of my PhD, and it did make a big difference when I was applying for academic jobs, my first academic job, for the panel to be able to see that I am able to publish, I'm interested in publishing, and they can see the type of research that you do. So I would emphasize that point emphatically. It's very important to publish towards the end of your PhD if you are thinking of going down the academic route. But certainly for getting onto the PhD, we would not necessarily be looking for academic publications. But there are other things you can do then as well during the PhD. And Lucy, if I can pick up with you here, so there are things like doing book reviews, etc. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we were encouraged on my program to kind of start with book reviews essentially, and indeed that was actually a task on one of our research methods class. So that's exactly what I did. I did a book review. I did a couple of book reviews during my PhD. It's also quite a nice way to get hold of books. And then towards the end of my PhD, I published in a more academic paper, I should say. Sorry, I was struggling there. So similar sort of thing. I would say book reviews. I also did kind of some blog posts for kind of bigger organisations. So I did something. So my PhD and my research interests are legal aid cuts. And I published a blog post on a human rights website before I'd published anything in the kind of academic journal. So there are kind of other little things that you can be doing to get little snippets of work out there and to kind of just test the water in publishing in other spaces too.
Cheers. Thanks, Lucy. And John, can I come to you on this topic as well? Because I know you've done a podcast for us recently on the transition from PhD student to lecturer, and you've been on appointment panels recently. So do you have any words of wisdom?
Yeah, lots of podcasts lately. So I think it's to reiterate actually something that's already been said, which is the sort of less is more to some extent. I think there was a period in academia where publications became more important in PhDs, and then it almost became a counting exercise. And I think it reflected to some extent the nature of the way academics were assessed at that point. There was a lot of focus on the quantity of work. One of the better changes that's happened in recent years in relation to the way that we're assessed, so the REF exercise, which Avena referred to, is that there are fewer pieces required, but of higher quality. So when we look to appoint, so recently there were appointments at Birmingham at a lecturer level, I wouldn't obviously be very impressed if someone had sort of 25 publications or something like that, but it was much less about that. It's obviously much more about potential when it comes to that first entry level. But as well as potential, and by potential I mean sort of, what theories do they work with, what empirical methodologies are they expert in, that sort of potential that you can see a future for their research. But it's also about showing what is their one piece, what is their show publication. And so the expectation and the hope certainly is to get to that sort of level would be to have at least one publication that comes out of your PhD, which is a good representation of the best work that you can possibly do. So I guess my advice here just very briefly would be have the conversation early with your supervisors. I sometimes have supervisees who wait until their second year and sort of nervously mention publications as if they weren't sure if they were supposed to yet. Have that conversation right from the word go, that's fine. but we will tell you to wait. And we'll tell you to wait until there's something that you can usefully contribute, where you can showcase, which is what I was looking for earlier, where you can showcase your kind of best work. That may well be in your second year, that may well be right at the end. Depends on the kind of work you do, whether it's empirical, whether there's project-based, whatever it might be. But have that conversation early, but it's about targeting what within my PhD or looking outside of it is the best thing that I can do, that when I finish this PhD, I have that in hand, but also I have something that shows my best work. And that's really what you should be targeting for that kind of job market.
Sure, John. And John, can I stay with you again just for the second part of this question from Eliana, because I know you are Director of Admissions at Birmingham. So the second part of the question here is about demonstrating academic potential on the PhD application form.
So yeah, I mean, what was mentioned in terms of publication, so we wouldn't expect, it's very, very rare for people to have academic publications coming into a PhD application stage. Obviously, if you do, then all the better, but it's by no means an expectation. I think some blog posts and things, if you've done the odd blog post that you're proud of, that you think sort of showcases perhaps the idea or the problem that you want to engage with for your PhD, that can be nice to refer to. And indeed, any feedback you've had from that experience can then inform your proposal to make your proposal that much better. But it's also important to remember that realistically, academics are getting a lot of these in terms of proposals. So your potential supervisors are unlikely to be tracking down everything that you've ever written. They're making their decision based on the pages of your proposal. That's the bit that's got to sing. So making sure you've got a nice clear CV that that you say, these are the stuff I've done, I'm active, I'm thoughtful, but that proposal is the most important bit. Much less so about sort of where you're publishing at that stage. That's something that we expect to develop during the PhD.
I would reiterate that completely, that the proposal is the key document. You're not expected to have published previously. We would look at your CV, but we do focus in more and more on the proposal itself. Can I move on to a point that I mentioned earlier in response to one of the other questions about my career at times has been essentially built on good fortune. So how important is it to be lucky in academia? So if I come to Lucy first on that.
Okay, so yeah, I've had my fair share of luck as well in academia. So I completed my PhD in early 2016. And it just so happened that 3 months after I completed, the institution where my external examiner was based advertised a load of posts. So obviously I got in touch with him and kind of scoped out what the situation might be and ended up where I am now at Sussex. So that was very fortunate. I think there is a degree of luck in these things for sure. And I guess it comes back to one of the points I think it was Avena mentioned before about kind of putting yourself out there a little bit, because even though obviously I was lucky there, it did take some work for me obviously to go and ask, like, is this something that it would be worth me putting an application for, and getting some feedback there. So yeah, there's luck built into it, but there's also a degree of kind of being prepared to put yourself in those situations, I think.
Yeah. Cheers, Lucy. Avena, do you have any thoughts on this about how important luck is?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, there is definitely a degree, I talk about being fortunate that things went relatively smoothly. I can't say they went completely smoothly, but relatively smoothly. And it is a competitive, to become an academic, it's a competitive job market. So there will always be an element of luck to it. But as Lucy said, there's also, if you put yourself out there, the hard work and the determination. I had a year of applying for jobs and being rejected from everything before I ever got an interview. So it wasn't all smooth sailing. So perseverance and determination along with luck, and I don't really like even say, but networking and knowing the right people does help when you get a name out there. So if you're presenting at conferences and the right person hears what you have to say or reads your work, and your name gets out there and you become associated with this particular issue or this particular topic, then there's recognition, which also helps a lot as well.
Cheers, Avena. And just for the last question, Avena, can I stay with you, then come to John, then come to Lucy in the last 3 minutes? So very briefly, for each of you, did you do a PhD for love or money?
I guess both. So like I said earlier, the kind of jobs that I was looking to do and the thing that I wanted to do, you know, kind of needed to get a PhD. But I chose my topic out of a passion for that specific topic. I was interested in something. I could sit on my own in a room for 4 years and study and write that thing. So there has to be, I think, unless you have an amazing job lined up and this is absolutely necessary to get a PhD in order to do that job, it has to be for love to be able to get through it and to stay sane through the process.
Cheers, Avena. Cheers, Avena. John, over to you.
Yeah, I basically agree. I mean, I think it has to be love to do it. If you've done a law degree, as long as you don't become a criminal barrister, then there are plenty more lucrative professions out there for you if you want to go that route. Having said that, academia has to pay, and that's why there's always disputes about paying academics properly, because if it doesn't pay properly, and then it's not viable for many of us, and then academia is much the poorer for it. So we shouldn't be overly kind of sort of head in the clouds. Like, it has to pay to make the job viable and to attract the best people to do the job in the best possible way for the variety of ideas and all the rest that comes with it. But yeah, you wouldn't do the job without loving it, and your parents will love you a lot more if you choose to be a commercial lawyer. Cheers,
John. Lucy, over to you.
Okay, so as a former legal aid lawyer, academia is more lucrative for me, but I completely agree. Actually, the primary motivation has got to be your love of the topic that you're going to be researching for a significant period of time. So unlike the rest of the legal profession, I would say, you know, academia is a better route financially than criminal legal aid law. But I certainly wouldn't still be here if I hadn't really felt passionate about the topic that I continue to research. So that does overtake any sort of financial considerations. You've got to really be invested in the area that you're researching.
Cheers, Lucy. And I'm conscious of time. We're just about up, but Lucy, once you're there, can I ask you this final question from Umair? What is the current academic job market like for potential PhD students with a 2-1 from a low-ranking university and a merit from a Russell Group university?
Okay, so I don't think that the undergraduate degree result is hugely important when you're coming into the academic job market. And actually, sorry, can you just repeat what the credentials are?
A 2-1 from a lower-ranking university and a merit from a Russell Group university.
I don't think there's any issue at all there. I mean, so as I said, I went to a teaching intensive undergraduate university. I did my master's at Kent, which is research intensive. But I've had no difficulty whatsoever in securing the PhD place and in getting an academic job post PhD, because I went to a teaching intensive undergrad institution. Nobody, I don't think, really looks at that. And the master's really was the vehicle for me to get on to the PhD, and it gave me kind of guidance on supervision and what the process would be like. So I don't think either of those things will be at all problematic.
Agree completely. If an application landed on my desk and that was the profile of the applicant, the 2-1 and a merit in the masters, I'm then moving on to look at the proposal, and I'm more concerned with the proposal rather than the CV. John, you want to come in on that? And John, can I also ask you, once you're answering that question, can you also pick up the other question from Ligia? If someone has two completely different topics that interest them, what should they consider when deciding which to follow?
Okay, on the first one, I was just going to basically agree with the two of you. The one thing I would say is, if you come with a 2-1 and a merit, that is a vehicle into a PhD, but it's going to be very, very difficult for achieving funding. Lots of people, will need funding, or certainly will want funding as they go into a PhD. But realistically, for funding, the competition is so high, you're looking at first-class undergraduate and distinction at masters really as almost a baseline to be competitive for that kind of funding. It can exceptionally go outside of that, but it's unlikely to. So that's where you're going to be held back a little bit. In terms of being successful in the PhD, publications, academic career afterwards, much less so. But that's just the one thing to be aware of. And an extra incentive to try really, really hard in all of your undergraduate studies, of course. The other one, two big topics, other ends of the spectrum. That's kind of good in a way. I mean, I guess the thing is to make a long list of all the pros and cons of the different places you would go under each topic. So under topic number A, you would ideally go with this supervisor at this institution. What are the funding options there? What's the life experience there, etc. Make a big column under column B. I love a column for the other topic, and pick the life you think is more attractive, or indeed apply for both and let fate decide. Because you have to be a little bit flexible with these things. But just never tell anybody that you have two competing options, because that makes you look very indecisive. So present yourself as all in both, and then see what happens.
Cheers, John. Avena, we have another question coming in. Can I turn to you on this one? So Pankti says, I feel that opportunities around criminal law are comparatively less in number than commercial law. So is that true? And second, are there more opportunities within practice or within academia?
Okay, I guess on the general opportunities one, I guess it depends on what kind of opportunities they're talking about, and Lucy's probably better placed to deal with opportunities in practice than I am. And was the second part whether there's more opportunities in practice or academia? Mm-hmm. It's hard to say. I mean, going into law, both practice and academia, it is competitive. Even with criminal law, which is one of the less desirable job routes because it's not lucrative, it is competitive. So I don't really know what the answer is to that question. I would base the decision more on what it is that you want to do and what you want of a career. So for me, I wanted to go into practice. I was idealistic. I wanted to make some kind of positive difference. But I realized, as Lucy sort of alluded to this earlier, that I could do that as an academic. I can engage with the issues, and maybe even more so from being outside of that system, but having access to the system to critique it and to engage with people within that system and to try to push forward an agenda and change than I would have been able to as a practitioner. So I think that it's competitive on both sides. I would base a decision on what it is that ultimately you want to get out of this.
And certainly for an academic career, my advice would be not to focus on what opportunities are there in criminal law or commercial law. Do, just as you said there, Avena, do what interests you most. If you're more interested in criminal law research, go down that avenue. If you're more interested in the commercial side of things, go down that route. But in terms of opportunities in practice or academia, Lucy, can we pass that one over to you?
Sure. I mean, it is difficult actually to say where there are more opportunities. So, as Avena said, both are really competitive. In criminal practice, there are opportunities out there. I think there might be diminishing opportunities out there just because of the way the market is operating. But I think the honest answer is, I think they're pretty on par in terms of the nature of the opportunities that are available to you. I suppose one thing that I should add is that if you are an academic with some practice experience as well, it does perhaps open up some other things to you in the sense, so I do clinical legal education too, which means that I supervise some students doing practical work as part of their degree. And the changing market of the law degree means that there are some skills that you might get from practice that can transfer quite nicely into academia. I suppose that's one thing. Well, I know there are some people here who have a practice background, so that might be something to throw into the mix. But I don't really think I can give an answer that says there are more opportunities in practice than there are in academia or vice versa. They're both equally competitive. They're both tough to get into, but they're also both worth it. It depends whether you see yourself working on a topic that you're really interested in and contributing to the really big agenda, or if you want to be kind of in this isn't meant in any sort of negative way, if you want to be on the ground dealing with the case then and there and helping the individuals then and there. It depends what your preference is, whether you want to go kind of big agenda or dealing with the nitty-gritty of individual cases.
Cheers, Lucy. And Lucy, we've had another question come in that I think might be ideal for you. So we have a question from Zenat, and Zenat is a barrister 5 years post-qualification, trained in crime, but is now shifted into public law. I think that's a great combination as well, the crime and public law overlap. But Zenat is interested in a PhD because they're disillusioned with the massively unjust criminal justice system. And says, despite case to case, that they would like to be involved when trying to make an impact or change at a higher level. So that sounds similar to your background as well, but they're not ready to let go of practice yet. So can you offer any thoughts on studying part-time while practicing, and also on how to marry the academic with the practice?
Yeah, okay, so definitely studying part-time and staying in practice, I think is a really good option in those circumstances. And I have to say, actually, the only reason that I went in full-time on my PhD is because that was the condition of my funding. So I dedicate myself in that way, but still kept the bit of practice element on the side. And you'll know, obviously, as a practitioner yourself, that weekend courts and things like that. So I used to sort of do the weekend courts to keep myself in practice as well. So I think studying part-time is actually a really good idea in those circumstances, is the short answer. And as I just said, I think that you will bring some other skills into academia that could be useful and are increasingly useful in academia, I'd say, in terms of the changing approach to qualification of solicitors. I would encourage, I think, part-time, because it was really intensive to do it full-time in practice, except that if you are kind of self-funding, or if you've got a funding body that doesn't require you to teach, you could probably still do a little bit of practice on the side as well. But I think it also, certainly for me, it helps my research that I have some practitioner contacts still, and I've kept kind of foot in the door in practice. But that's very much because of the nature of the research that I do. So I look at how policy has affected lawyers. So of course it's helpful for me. So I know we keep saying this, but it all comes down to really what your topic is, what it is you're interested in finding out about. And for me, I can engage better with policymakers and think tanks, etc., as an academic than I ever could as a practitioner. So I feel better able to contribute to that bigger discussion as an academic.
I think that question and answer shows that there is no one set approach or no clear, definite answer for anything academic related. I think that's really good to bear in mind. I am conscious of time, so can I take advantage and pick one final question? Just the question is for Avena, based on something you have said there, Lucy, about engaging with policymakers. So I know you do it a lot with your research, and Avena, I know you have done it recently with some of your recent research. So any advice on engaging with policymakers?
Advice on what's in how to engage with, or to, okay, yeah, because it's a good thing to do. Depending on what if you're, if you're a pure theory person, then you probably don't need to be going out engaging with policymakers. But if you're researching and interested in practical issues and reform, then it is a good thing to do. In terms of advice on how to, just approaching people. If you approach policymakers someone in the Ministry of Justice or wherever it might be, and say, hey, I'm an academic or PhD student working on this, and I'd be interested in talking to you about this, or can you provide any information on this? And then the further you get into your career, the more likely they are to seek you out for you. They seek you out for your advice.
You did that with your research on, is it hate crime, where you presented at Parliament, or was the report on that?
Our report on that was launched in the House of Commons, and it was the principal investigator on the project. I don't know if I should be giving away his secrets or not, but was just approaching MPs and saying, hey, are you interested in this? Will you host us? And Bob Neal said, yeah, this sounds great. So again, it was putting yourself out there, and then you get to launch your research report in the House of Commons with all of these influential policymakers there.
Cheers, Avena. And John, final word on that, because you're involved, speaking of law reform, you have a law reform network.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's various ways, obviously, with engaging with law reformers. So one route, which was a route, as you mentioned, I've taken, it's called the Criminal Law Reform Now Network, and it's essentially a network of academics to come together. So the idea being that you can have a stronger voice, and certainly one that's better informed if you bring people together from different universities. One of the wonderful things about academia is that we're not overly sort of territorial about our various universities, but you realize quite quickly that your world tends to be around the kind of research you do, and that world is relatively small, although it's dotted all over the country and sometimes all over the world. So bringing people together in that way to speak with something of a united voice when talking to policymakers can be really, really useful. I would say, actually, one of the things I was told early on in my PhD, which I think definitely rings true, I had a presentation from somebody who had come in from the Home Office, and they were saying they always found it very peculiar that when academics approached them, they would do it very apologetically and sort of almost quite nervously to say, I've been working on this only for the last 40 years of my life, but maybe I have a couple of things to say. And her point was, and I think it's really well made, is it's great to have academics and PhDs approach you when you're in these positions, because when you're in places like Home Office, Ministry of Justice, whatever it might be, you're often working on projects in quite short periods of time that you have to cram information on really, really quickly. So to have someone coming from academia or from their PhD who is willing to offer you their expertise, their sort of hard-fought expertise to try and inform the work that you're doing is excellent. And we should all be that much more confident in making those connections and recognizing that we're really adding value. And it's part of what we all want to do in terms of kind of making the law and the world better and all the rest of it. But that's important. And the only way you can do that is by making those connections with those people who are creating policy. And fortunately, I think that's a gap between academia and policy making, which is shrinking. For various reasons, but it's a positive development, I think.
Cheers, John. And John, can I put this last question to you as well? So if a person says that they have a weak spot for citation, how can they improve their citation skills on their own for a proposal?
For citation skills, so usually Oscola is the default for most of us. So yeah, it's amazing how late in education and academia people can get and still reference terribly. But it's a bit like Colin said when he mentioned about spelling mistakes can be off-putting in proposals. It's true. Silly little things like that can be distracting. And if you've got a big pile of proposals, and some people really get a lot of PhD proposals, something as silly as bad grammar, bad spelling, bad citations can just give you a negative feeling about a proposal from the word go, and that's obviously not what you want. So just beat yourself up a bit and make sure you do it properly. So in my case, as again, back to being poor old dyslexic academic, it means bullying family members into proofreading my work, because as good as Word is at spotting spelling mistakes and things, it's not perfect. So, I realize I have to do that to make sure that documents that matter are really spot on. And same with referencing. Get your Oscola quick referencing guide, the one-page one, which is nice and easy. Get the big book one if you need for greater detail, and just take your time and do it properly. I think I got my first education of it when I went to the Law Commission, and there was a guy there who basically covered every citation I did in red ink until I beat myself up a bit and did it properly. And it's just something we all have to go through at some stage. And once you got it right, it's easy. But just do it, check. And then once you've got the form right, it's straightforward from there.
Cheers, John, and thanks to Avena and to Lucy as well. We hope that this webinar has been useful for everyone online. And there are also the IALS PhD Masterclass podcasts available online on different topics if you might be interested in those. So thanks to our panel, and thanks to everyone for turning up here today. Cheers.